Chapter 3: The League of Nations and International Relations in the 1930s. This chapter analyzes how the Great Depression unleashed forces that destroyed the peace settlements of 1919 and led to the rise of Hitler and more militant policies in Italy and Japan, which ultimately led to the outbreak of the Second World War. It analyzes these problems by considering questions. How did the rise of extremism affect international relations? 3.1. The interwar period saw the rise of extreme political ideas and regimens. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought a communist regime to power, which intensified its hold on the Russian people by increasing use of violent repression. Its stated aim was to encourage world revolution, and in 1919, it set up a body to spread communism, the Comintern. Although in practice the regime concentrated on socialism in one country, the threat of the spread of communism was an important element in international affairs and on the rise of dictatorships in the other European countries. In 1922, Benito Mussolini took office as the head of the parliamentary organization, the Italian Fascist Party, whose aim was to resist communism and socialism while delivering national revival under a dictatorship rather than a parliamentary state. By 1925, Mussolini's authority had been established and a state based on the extreme right-wing ideology was set up. This had come about because of economic distress in post-war Italy. However, the most significant development was the rise of National Socialism and the establishment of a National Socialist, Nazi, state under Adolf Hitler in 1933. This was a direct result of a mixture of post-war grievances being intensified by the impact of one of the world's most severe economic depressions. The Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash, marked a turning point in the interwar history. Not only did it weaken the economic and social stability of the world's major powers, but it also dealt a devastating blow to the progress made since 1924 towards creating a new framework for peaceful international cooperation. Along with the two world wars, it could be seen as the third global catastrophe of the century, as historian Robert Boyce called it in 1989. The impact of the Great Depression on political ideologies. It is hard to exaggerate the international impact of the Great Depression. After 1924, Europe's economy recovery had been to a large extent dependent on the short-term U.S. loans, of which $4 billion went to Germany. After the Wall Street Stock Exchange crashed in 1929, U.S. investors abruptly terminated these loans and no more were forthcoming. This was a devastating blow to the European and global economies between 1929 and 1932. The volume of world trade fell by 70%. Unemployment rose to 13 million in the USA, 6 million in Germany, and to 6 million in Britain. Japan was particularly hit hard. Some 50% of its mining and heavy industrial capacity was forced to close, and the collapse of the U.S. market virtually destroyed its large and lucrative export trade in silk. The Depression alone did not bring about political extremism in Japan. Nationalism had been growing since the First World War and had its origins in resentment at foreign influence since 1854. In Germany, the loss of the First World War and resentment at the Treaty of Versailles had already caused the rise of nationalist parties, while economic hardships saw the growth of communism. However, the effects of the Depression intensified loss of faith in the democratic system as hardships increased with unemployment, hunger, and despair for the future. The attractions of extreme groups who promised a completely new system rather than just the usual domestic policies increased. Neither communism nor Nazism had much electoral support by 1928. But after the crash of 1929, both parties attracted more voters as the moderate politicians seemed unable to cope with the crises. The Nazis offered a national revival based on the unity of the German race, ending the hated restrictions of Versailles, and promoting Germany as a great power. The communists offered a social revolution which would give workers power and end the effects of the hated world capitalism system. By 1932, very large numbers of Germans were supporting anti-democratic parties, and the prospect of one-party dictatorships. This was in a very large part the result of the prolonged economic depression, which showed, at least in the public's views, few signs of getting better by the early 1933, when Hitler finally took office as chancellor. The depression also had a major effect on international affairs. It saw the rise of nationalist policies. Japan backed a military expansion in the Chinese province of Manchuria to gain raw materials and markets in 1931. The USA became more isolationist and imposed tariff restrictions to protect its economy. Powers like Britain and France became more concerned with their economies than in spending money on defense or supporting international order through the League of Nations. In Germany, Hitler's regime had clearly stated aims for expansion and overturning the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. Thus, the Depression changed the whole way that international relations were conducted. The impact of the rise of dictatorships on the relations between the great powers, 1933 to 1935. There had been a gradual rise in dictatorial regimes in Europe after 1920, and also an increase in nationalism. The foreign policy of Italy had been aggressive and expansionist. In the 1920s, though Italy had also participated in international agreements, however, the rise of power of Hitler led to Germany adopting an even more uncompromising foreign policy, leading eventually to war in 1939. Nazi foreign policy and rearmament, 1933 to 1935. Hitler's intense nationalism and desire to overturn Versailles could not be delivered in the early stages of his foreign policy because of the weakness of the German armed forces. The French had the strongest army in Europe and could invade Germany at any time if they so wished. At sea, Germany could not begin to match the power of British Navy. Hitler had no foreign allies. Mussolini was suspicious of Hitler's rise, even though he was a fellow dictator, and feared that German-speaking inhabitants of northern Italy would be a target for German expansion. Hitler was obliged to show that he was in fact a moderate statesman, so that even though the deeply resented Polish control of German-speaking areas, he made a pact to avoid any possible confrontation in the east. The pact seriously weakened France's security system in Eastern Europe, and as it had relied on its alliance with Poland to put pressure on Germany's eastern frontiers. The attempted Nazi coup in Austria, July 1934. Hitler was aware of Germany's vulnerability, but over Austria he hoped a more provocative line. In June 1934, he met Mussolini in Venice and tried to convince him that Austria should become a German satellite. When Mussolini rejected this, as he was determined to keep Austria as a buffer state between Italy and Germany, Hitler gave the Austrian Nazis strong unofficial encouragement to stage in July what turned out to be a disastrously unsuccessful uprising in Vienna. Mussolini immediately mobilized troops on the Berner frontier and forced Hitler to disown the coup. The incident brought about a sharp deterioration in the German-Italian relations and appeared to rule out any prospect of an alliance. Hitler was not strong enough to offer support for the Austrian Nazis at this stage. German rearmament, 1933 to 1935. Without a buildup of arms, ending the Treaty of Versailles restrictions, Germany would not be able to play a major role in European affairs. The Depression had not only helped to bring Hitler to power with this plan, but it also helped to explain why the other European powers took so little action to defend the Versailles Treaty. German rearmament brought about a considerable change in international relations. Ultimately, Hitler's intention was to mobilize the whole German economy and society for war. In July 1933, the decision was taken to create an independent Luftwaffe. In December, which is the German Air Force. In December, plans were announced for a peacetime army of 300,000 men. In March 1935, conscription was reintroduced despite the fears of his advisors that this would lead to the French military intervention. A naval programme was also drawn up, which would produce a moderate-sized German fleet of 8 battleships, 3 aircrafts, aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 48 destroyers, and 72 submarines by 1949. In reaction to the introduction of German conscription, the British, French, and Italian heads of government met in April at Stresa in Italy to condemn German rearmament and resolve to maintain the peace settlements. Hitler responded by attempting to reassure the powers of his peaceful intentions. He proposed a series of non-aggression pacts with Germany's neighbors and promised to observe Locarno and to accept an overall limitation of armaments. He also offered Britain an agreement limiting the German fleet to 35% of the total strength of the Royal Navy. Britain accepted this offer in June without consulting the other Stresa powers and effectively destroyed the unity of the Stresa front. The reaction of the great powers to Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1935. For the great powers, 1933 to 1935 was a period in which they had to come to terms with the reality of Nazi Germany. In 1933, even though Germany was only just beginning to rearm, its strength was potentially far greater than in 1914, as it was enhanced by a ring of weakness which had been created in 1919 out of the ruins of the Austrian-Russian empires around its eastern and European frontiers. France and Germany. By 1934, France had lost the diplomatic leadership of Europe, which it had exercised in the immediate post-war years. The French economy had been weakened by the Depression and its social cohesion threatened by a wave of rioting sparked in February 1934 by the exposure of a series of financial scandals. French society was deeply divided as the right wanted to negotiate with Hitler and Mussolini, while the left wanted to fight fascism and look to Russia as an ally. Even if France had still possessed the will to intervene military in Germany, the Locarno treaties prevented it from reoccupying the Rhineland. Neither could it rely on Poland after the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of January 1934. France's response to the new Nazi Germany was therefore hesitant and sometimes contradictory. The French sought to contain Germany as they had done in 1919 through a network of alliances and pacts, but, like the British, they also tried to negotiate with Hitler. Although ultimately Britain remained France's major European partner, it was not ready to commit itself to an alliance with France. The French therefore attempted to strengthen their links with the Eastern European states and negotiate agreements with Italy and Russia. Franco-Italian negotiations and the Rome Agreement. In its attempts to negotiate an Italian alliance, France was greatly assisted by the unsuccessful Nazi coup in Vienna, which more than anything convinced Mussolini that a military agreement with France was essential. In January 1935, both countries signed the Rome Agreement, by which they undertook not to mediate in the affairs of their Balkan neighbors and to act together in the event of German rearmament or another threat to Austrian independence. In June, direct Franco-Italian military staff talks started to discuss joint military action in the event of a German attack on Austria, Italy, or France. Franco-Russian negotiations. Parallel with these negotiations, talks were proceeding between the French and the Russians. The French intended to enmesh Soviet Russia in an elaborate treaty of regional assistance, or in other words, an Eastern European version of the Locarno treaties, which would be signed but not only by Russia but also by Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states. This was to be strengthened by a separate Franco-Russian agreement, which would associate Russia with the Locarno agreements in Western Europe and France with the proposed Eastern Pact. But the whole plan came to nothing as both Germany and Poland refused to join. The Poles were more suspicious of the Russians than of the Germans. France had therefore little option but to negotiate with Soviet Russia alone. By May, the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance was signed, but Paris refused to follow up the treaty with detailed military staff talks between the two armies. This was mainly because French public opinion on the right was deeply suspicious of the USSR. Franco-German negotiations. France, conscious of economic weakness at home and its deep social divisions, together with a considerable amount of feeling against another costly war, was willing to negotiate with Hitler. Its aims was to draw the Germans into negotiating an agreement guaranteeing the Versailles system. Hitler was ready when it suited him to lower the political temperature through cordial diplomacy exchanges, but he was not ready to tolerate the restrictions with the French, and British diplomacy was attempting to entangle him. Great Britain and Germany. Britain was also suffering from economic problems and the huge cost of defending a worldwide empire. It was therefore prepared to negotiate, then actively oppose German rearmament. In 1933, it faced a growing threat not only from Germany and Europe, but also from Japan and the Far East. Consequently, the main aim of British policy towards Germany was to blunt Hitler's aggression by continuing to modify the Treaty of Versailles peacefully, while simultaneously drawing Germany back into the League, where it could be tied down in multilateral agreements on security. Sir John Simon, the Foreign Secretary, summed up this policy in a letter to King George V in February 1935. Italy. Mussolini, who had extensive territorial aims in the Balkans and North Africa, at first attempted to maintain a special position as mediator between Germany on the one hand and Britain and France on the other. He hoped that this would result in concessions from both sides. However, the unsuccessful Nazi putsch in Vienna in July 1934 and the German announcement of conscription in March 1935 led Italy to align itself firmly with Britain and France at the Stresa Conference in an attempt to preserve what was left of the Versailles settlement. Mussolini's hopes that this alignment with Britain and France would result in British and French support for the Italian colonization of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, were not realized. As we shall see later, Italia's invasion of Abyssinia in October 1935 was opposed by the League, Britain, and France, and ultimately resulted in Italy looking to Berlin for support in the emergence of the Rome-Berlin axis. Soviet Russia. Stalin, like the other European leaders, reacted cautiously to the Nazi takeover of power. His distrust of the West was at least as great as his fear of Nazi Germany. Consequently, even though he negotiated a defensive agreement with the French and sought collective security by joining the League of Nations, in September 1934, he also attempted to maintain good relations with Germany, despite such setbacks as the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact. The Soviet negotiations with the French in the spring of 1935 were also accompanied by a series of secret talks with Germany, which mirrored the French tactics of trying for a settlement with Hitler in the summer of 1935. Soviet Nazi talks continued intermittently right up to February 1936. Only with the ratification of the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance by the French Parliament were they broken off, but were renewed in the summer of 1939. The USA. The USA was committed to a foreign policy which would not involve it in a European war. Thus, the rise of Hitler and his early moves to rearm by 1935 produced little official reaction in the USA. In 1933, there was considerable sympathy in the USA for the economic hardships that Germany was suffering as a result of the Depression. While both Britain and France were viewed with some suspicion on account of their huge colonial empires, however, with the coming to power of Hitler and the beginning of the persecution of Jewish people, public opinion in the USA began to become more hostile to Germany. Even though U.S. foreign policy still remained firmly isolationist, the main concern of the government was the Far East, not Germany. Even there was no indication of active intervention. The USA was alarmed by the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, but did no more than make diplomatic protests. Indeed, the Temporary Neutrality Act of 1935, by empowering President Roosevelt to ban the supply of arms to all belligerents, whether aggressors or victims of aggression, in the event of the outbreak of war, strengthened the U.S. policy of non-involvement. Summary. The reaction to the rise of Hitler and his initial policies, which showed that he would not be bound by the disarmament restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, demonstrated that he and other powers were unlikely to make a united stand to protect the treaty. Hitler was thus encouraged to take further steps towards his immediate goals of overturning it, and moving towards his longer-term aims of creating living space. By consequences in Eastern Europe, this lack of opposition can be explained by fear of public opposition to war, by economic problems, by concerns about the problems and costs of defense in other areas, especially the Far East, and by unease about the fairness of the peace settlements. Only a minority of statesmen understood the true extent of the long-term aims of Hitler and his extreme personality, and most assumed that he could be negotiated with in a normal, rational, diplomatic manner. Foreign responses to the Civil War in Spain, 1936 to 1939. The extreme political ideas of the interwar period were evident in Spain, which had also suffered from economic hardships. These led to the outbreak of a civil war in 1936, which came to have a major impact on international relations. In 1931, the Spanish monarchy ended and a republic was set up. This was deeply divided between the forces of the left, anarchists and communists, and the forces of the right, traditional monarchists and conservatives, and the new fascist party, the Falange. The left-wing groups were bitterly opposed to the power of the Catholic Church, and the forces of the conservative rallied to its support. Strikes and political violence increased. The army was politically conservative, and in 1936 it launched a takeover which aimed to overturn the left-wing Republican government. The war which followed lasted until 1939. The Civil War in Spain was essentially a domestic matter which rapidly became an international issue, threatening to involve the major powers in a European conflict. The nationalists, as the rebels called themselves, were led by General Franco and looked to Germany and Italy for help, while the Republicans approached Britain, France, and the Soviet Russia. Foreign aid was given to both sides. Germany and Italian intervention. Hitler quickly agreed to provide a fleet of transportation aircraft to fly Franco's soldiers in Spanish Morocco across to Spain. He then followed this up with the dispatch of some 6,000 troops. Hitler certainly wanted to stop Spain from becoming communist, but he also wanted to distract the Western powers so that he could continue to rearm without fear of intervention. He was too aware of the advantages of having a friendly government in Madrid, which would not only supply Germany with Spanish mineral resources, but also in wartime possibly provide bases for German submarines. Mussolini also agreed to assist Franco for the same mixture of ideology and strategic reasons. He hoped to defeat the left in Spain, gain a new ally in Franco, who might grant Italy a naval base on the Balearic Islands, and strengthen the Italian character by exposure to war. As the Italian invasion of Abyssinia had now been opposed, admittedly as ineffectively, by Britain, France, and the League of Nations, he was also anxious to draw closer to Germany. The non-intervention policy of Britain and France. With both Germany and Italy openly helping Franco, there was a real danger of a European war should France and Britain be drawn in on the Republican side. When the French Prime Minister Léon Blum, whose power rested on the left-wing coalition, was first asked for help by the Republic, he was tempted to give it, if only to deny potential allies of Germany a victory in Spain. However, two factors forced him to have second thoughts. First, the actual dispatch of French military aid to the Republicans would have polarized French society, which was already deeply divided between right and left, and run the risk of plunging France into a civil war of its own. Second, the British government came out strongly against intervention. The British ambassador in Paris even threatened neutrality should French assistance to the Republicans lead to war with Germany. Despite the strategic dangers for Britain's position in the Mediterranean in the event of a nationalist victory, the cabinet viewed the Civil War as essentially a side issue, which must not be allowed to prevent its continued search from a lasting settlement with Germany. In addition, there were powerful voices within the Conservative Party who actively sympathized with Franco. To prevent the war from spreading, Britain and France proposed a non-intervention agreement. This was signed by the other European powers, but Germany and Italy ignored it and continued to assist Franco. Soviet intervention. The Republican government, therefore, had little option but to approach Soviet Russia for help. In September 1936, Stalin sent hundreds of military advisors and large quantities of military equipment, while the Comintern was made responsible for recruiting bridges of international volunteers. Stalin, like Hitler, saw the Civil War as a way of dividing his enemies. A conflict between the Western powers and Germany would certainly have suited Stalin's policy, but he was also anxious to prevent a nationalist victory in Spain, since this would strengthen the forces of international fascism and make a German attack on the Soviet Union more likely. However, by early 1937, when he realized that the Republicans could not win, he reduced the flow of arms to a level that was sufficient to prolong the conflict. In this, he was successful, as it was not until March 1939 that Franco at last occupied Madrid. The consequences of the Civil War. It was undoubtedly Germany who benefited most from the conflict, since it diverted the attention of the powers during the crucial period of April 1936 to February 1938, away from the Nazi rearmament program. For the Democracies, the Civil War could not have come at a worse time. It polarized public opinion between right and left, threatened France with encirclement, and cemented the Italian-German rapprochement. In October 1936, Germany and Italy, after a visit by the Italian foreign minister, signed the October Protocols, which were in effect an Italian-German entente and eventually led the way to the Pact of Steel in May 1939. The defeat of the Republic was a blow for the cause of democracy and might have caused a serious encirclement for France had Franco's Spain been too exhausted by war to want to take any part in a conflict in support of Germany and Italy. The war divided opinion in Europe and brought about a feeling among some people that fascism was on the move and needed to be stopped. It also showed the destructive power of modern war, as in the well-publicized bombing by German aircraft of the Republican town of Grunisha, immortalized by a painting by Picasso, and increased fear of war. The war also revealed to Hitler and Mussolini the weakness of Britain and France. It showed too that Stalin's communists were more intent on fighting their internal opponents than the forces of fascism, and so generally encouraged Hitler to risk greater expansion. Aims and impact of Hitler's expansionist policies 1936 to 1939. The immediate aims of Hitler's expansionism was the revision of the Treaty of Versailles. He sent troops into the Rhineland to end the forced demilitarization imposed by the treaty. He would have supported a coup by the Nazis in Austria, but was prevented by Italian opposition and by the fact that German armed forces were still limited, as rearmament had only started the year before. Nevertheless, he achieved a union with Austria in 1938 because Italy no longer opposed this. Thus far, the reaction of France and Britain was limited because it would have been hard to enthuse their populations from a war to prevent German people being together in a state which had, despite its extreme ideas, a great deal of popular support for its economic achievements and the ending of international political conflict. Revision of the peace treaties now focused on Germany gaining the German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia and Poland. The so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia contained largely German speakers, but the area had never been part of Germany. As such, Hitler's demands were met by a policy of appeasement by Britain, followed by France, of avoiding war by offering to make what appeared to be reasonable concessions. Though both countries were uneasy, the policy commanded public support until Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939. This crossed the line from revision of a peace treaty to naked aggression and conquest of other nations. The aims of Germany were now seen to be wider than merely regaining a lost land and seemed to be closer to the wilder ideas of creating living space for the German race that had hitherto been regarded as more rhetoric. Thus, the German invasion of Poland was met by declarations of war by France and Britain. The war against Poland had the character of a violent racial conquest and indicated that ideological motives would dominate future German foreign policy. Hitler's long-term aims. In the Mein Kampf, Hitler was quite specific about the main thrust of Nazi foreign policy. Germany was to turn its gaze towards the land in the east, which above all meant Russia. This country was to be turned into a huge German colony whose resources would eventually enable Germany to challenge the British Empire and the USA. Historians debate whether this was still his intention in 1933. A.J.P. Taylor, 1961, argued that he was just aiming to make Germany the greatest power in Europe from her national weight by exploiting every opportunity that presented itself. Hans Mossmann, a German historian, also doubts whether Hitler had a consistent foreign policy of unchanging priorities, and points out that it was usually determined by economic pressures and demands for action from within the Nazi Party. The history of Nazi foreign policy generates such controversy because Hitler's actions were so often ambiguous and contradictory. Despite this, there is a general consensus among historians that Hitler did intend to wage a series of wars which would ultimately culminate in a struggle for global and racial homogeny. As the historian Alan Bullock, 1971, has argued, the key to understanding Hitler's foreign policy is that he combined consistency of aim with complete opportunism in method and tactics. Remilitarization of the Rhineland, 1936. The remilitarization of the Rhineland marked an important stage in Hitler's plans for rebuilding German power. The construction of strong fortifications would enable him to stop any French attempts to invade Germany. Hitler had originally planned to remilitarize the Rhineland in 1937, but the favorable diplomatic situation created by the Abyssinian crisis persuaded him to act in March 1936. He justified this arguing that the Franco-Soviet Pact was contrary to the Locarno Agreement and a direct threat to German security. Crucial to the success of his plan was the attitude of Italy. Mussolini, isolated from the other Swiss powers because of the Abyssinian policy, had little option but to reassure Germany that he would not cooperate with the British and French to enforce Locarno if German troops entered the Rhineland. German troops marched into the Rhineland on March 7, 1936. In order to reassure France that they did not intend to violate the Franco-German frontier, they were initially, at any rate, few in number and lightly equipped. So why did French army not immediately intervene? The French General Staff, which since the late 1920s had been planning for a defensive war against Germany, based on the fortifications of the Maginot Line on France's eastern frontier, refused to invade the Rhineland unless they had full backing from the British. The most the British government was ready to do was to promise France that in the event of an unprovoked German attack on French territory, it would send 2 divisions of troops across the Channel. Essentially, British public opinion was convinced that Hitler was merely walking into his own back garden. The crucial element here, it seemed, was that Germany was not occupying new territory. It was putting forces into German territory and allowing for a legitimate defense of frontiers. That was the right of any state, yet was denied to Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Given that Britain and France had accepted German rearmament and that Britain had even signed a naval treaty, it would have seemed illogical to have taken military action to stop the remilitarization. Also, in an age of air power, arguably, the shifting of border defenses an extra 50 miles or so had little real military significance in itself. The remilitarization would have made an unconvincing case for war. However, the consequences were to make war more likely. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a triumph for Hitler, as it marked a decisive shift in power from Paris to Berlin. It was also a considerable gamble. German rearmament had not got very far by 1936, and any Decisive French resistance would have driven the German forces out and possibly toppled the Hitler regime. At a stroke, Hitler had violated both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact without any effective response from Britain and France. Rearmament, 1936 to 1939. After the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the pace of German rearmament accelerated. Hitler appointed Hermann Göring to implement the 4-year plan, which was to prepare Germany for war by 1940. Through raising taxes, government loans, and cutting consumer expenditure, military expenditure nearly quadrupled between 1937 and 1939. An ambitious program E for the production of synthetic materials was also stated to beat the impact of a future British blockade. By August 1939, the Luftwaffe had 4,000 frontline aircrafts, and the strength of the army had risen to 2,758,000 men. In January 1939, Hitler also announced plans for the construction of a major battle fleet to challenge Britain. Despite the initial target of 1940 set by the 4-year plan, the German rearmament program was planned to be ready in the mid-1940s. In the meantime, as the historian Richard Oversary observes, Hitler pursued a policy of putting as much as possible in the shop window to give the impression that Germany was armed in greater depth than was in fact the case. Hitler considers his options, April 1936 to February 1938. By the autumn of 1937, Hitler had virtually dismantled the Europe created by the Locarno and Versailles treaties. Owing to the following factors, he had also greatly strengthened Germany's position in Europe, even though he had given up the idea of an alliance with Britain. The Spanish Civil War and the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War had distracted the potential enemies. Italy was drawing ever closer to Germany as the October Protocol showed. In November, Germany was further strengthened when Hitler signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan. This was of more symbolic than practical importance, as it was aimed at the Comintern rather than the USSR, but it nevertheless showed that Nazi Germany was no longer isolated. Potentially, Italy, Japan, and Germany were in a position to put the democracies under great pressure. Hitler was thus in a favorable position to consider options for a new and more aggressive phase of foreign policy. On November 5, 1937, he was therefore able to outline his commanders-in-chief and foreign and war ministers a possible scenario involving civil war in France or even a Franco-Italian war, which would enable him to annex Austria and dismember Czechoslovakia without fear of international intervention. He achieved these aims in 1938 to 1937. Even though the circumstances that he had predicted never in fact came about, both the Entente and the eventual destruction of Czechoslovakia do indeed show Hitler's ability to adapt his tactics to the prevailing circumstances while steadily pursuing his overall aims. The Entente. The annexation of Austria had long been a key aim of Nazi foreign policy, but Hitler did not plan the actual events that enabled him to achieve it. The crisis was ultimately triggered when Schaschning, the Austrian chancellor, alarmed by the activities of the Austrian Nazis, requested an interview with Hitler. Hitler welcomed the chance to achieve an easy diplomatic success by imposing on him an agreement which would not only have subordinated Austrian foreign policy to Berlin, but also have given the Austrian Nazi Party complete freedom. However, Schaschning then decided unexpectedly to regain some room for maneuver by asking his countrymen to vote in a referendum, which he planned to hold on Sunday, March 14th, for a free and German independent and social Christian and united Austria. The German army occupies Austria. The immediate danger for the German government was that if Schanning's appeal was endorsed by a large majority, he would be able to renounce his agreement with Hitler. Confronted by this challenge, Hitler rapidly dropped his policy of gradual absorption of Austria and not only forced Strauss-Jung to cancel the referendum, but on March 12th ordered the German army to occupy Austria. Then Hitler decided, apparently on the spur of the moment, after a highly successful visit to the Austrian city of Linz, where he had attended secondary school as a boy, to incorporate Austria into the Reich rather than install a satellite Nazi government in Vienna. The reaction of Italy, Britain, and France. Besides violating the Treaty of Versailles, which specifically forbade the union of Germany and Austria, Hitler had for the first time invaded an independent state, even though the Austrian army did not oppose him, and put himself in a position from which to threaten Czechoslovakia. Why they did not bring about a repetition of the Stresa Front that was briefly formed in 1934 against German aggression. Although British Prime Minister Chamberlain was in contact with the Italian government and in April had concluded an agreement aimed at lowering the tension in the Mediterranean, essentially Mussolini had decided as long ago as 1936 that Austria was a German sphere of interest. Not surprisingly, therefore, on March 11, 1938, he backed Hitler's decision to invade Austria. Both Britain and France protested to Berlin, but neither had any intention of going to war over Austria. Indeed, the French were paralyzed by an internal political crisis caused by the resignation of Kemal Chap's ministry, and between March 10 and 13th did not even have a government. The Sudeten crisis. The annexation of Austria with the minimum of international protest greatly increased the vulnerability of Czechoslovakia to Nazi pressure, as it was now surrounded on three sides by German territory. Hitler had long regarded Czechoslovakia with its alliances with both France and Russia as a strategic threat to Germany, which would eventually have to be eliminated. It is, however, arguable that in April 1938, Hitler was not sure how he was to carry out this aim. He certainly played with the idea of launching a sudden attack on Czechoslovakia if a major crisis were to be triggered, for instance by the assassination of the German ambassador in Peru. An easier and safer way to bring about the disintegration of Czechoslovakia was to inflame the nationalism of the Sudeten Germans. Czechoslovakia was a fragile state undermined by an ethnically divided population. Its unity was particularly threatened by the 3 million Sudeten Germans and the 2 million Slovaks. Hitler, therefore, specifically instructed Konrad Henlein, the Sudeten German leader, to keep making demands for concessions which the Peru government could not possibly grant if it wanted to preserve the unity of Czechoslovakia. In the aftermath of the Enchilants, both Britain and France were acutely aware of the growing threat to Czechoslovakia. Britain was unwilling to guarantee Czechoslovakia, and yet realized that it might well not be able to stand aloof from the consequences of a German attack on it. Chamberlain told the Commons on March 24th that if fighting occurred, something. The French, unlike the British, were pledged by two treaties signed in 1924 and 1925 to consult and assist Czechoslovakia in the event of a threat to their common interests. In reality, the French were in no position to help the Czechs. The chief of the French air shaft, who was in charge of operational planning, made no secret of his fears and that the French Air Force would be wiped out within 15 days. After the outbreak of war with Germany, the French government was therefore ready to follow the British lead in seeking a way of diffusing the Sudeten crisis before it could result in war. The May crisis. The urgency of this was underlined by the war scare of the weekend of May 20th to 21st, 1938, when the Czech government suddenly partially mobilized its army in response to false rumors that a German attack was imminent. Hitler, warned by both Britain and France of the dangerous consequences of any military action, rapidly proclaimed the absence of any
mobilization plans. Yet far from making Hitler more reasonable, this incident appears to have had the opposite effect, as he immediately stepped up military preparations for invasion and set October 1st as a deadline for smashing Czechoslovakia. A.J.P. Taylor, 1961, sees this as a bluff and argues that Hitler did not need to act, others would do his work for him. There were certainly, as we have seen, powerful forces working for the disintegration of the Czech state, but most historians do not dismiss Hitler's plans so lightly. It is more likely that he was just keeping his options open, as Bullock argues, to the very last possible moment. Meanwhile, France and Britain were redoubling their efforts to find a peaceful solution. The Anglo-French peace strategy aimed to put pressure on both Czechs and the Sudeten Germans to make concessions while continuing to warn Hitler of the dangers of a general war. In early September, Beneš, the Czech prime minister, responded to the pressure by granting almost all Helen's demands, as this threatened the justification for Hitler's campaign against Czechoslovakia. Hitler immediately instructed Helen to provoke a series of incidents which would enable him to break off the talks with the Brens. Chamberlain intervenes. On September 12, 1938, Hitler's campaign moved into a new phase when in a speech at the Nuremberg rally, he violently attacked the Czechs and assured the Sudetens of his support. Both Britain and France desperately attempted to avoid war. Daladier, the French prime minister, suggested that he and Chamberlain should meet Hitler, but Chamberlain seized the initiative and flew to see Hitler on September 15th at Berchtesgaden. Then he agreed, subject to consultation with the French, that Czechoslovakia should cede to Germany all areas which contain the German population of 50% or over. This would be supervised by an international commission. Hitler also demanded that Czechoslovakia should renounce its pact with Soviet Russia. When Chamberlain again met Hitler at Bad Godesberg on September 22nd, after winning French backing for his plan, Hitler demanded that the German occupation of the Sudetenland should be speeded up so that it would be completed by September 28th. Nor was it to be supervised by any international commission. Why Hitler should suddenly have changed his mind has puzzled historians. Taylor argued that Hitler was anxious to avoid accepting Chamberlain's plan in the hope that the Hungarians and Poles would formulate their own demands for Czechoslovakia territory, and that he would then be able to move in and occupy the whole state under the pretext of being a peacemaker creating a new world order. On the other hand, it is possible that Hitler had no such elaborate plan in his mind and merely wanted to eliminate Czechoslovakia once and for all through war. At this stage, Chamberlain's peace initiative seemed to have failed. France and Britain reluctantly began to mobilize, although both powers still continued to seek a negotiated settlement. The Munich Agreement. In retrospect, it is often argued that the French and British should have gone to war and called Hitler's bluff. Chamberlain's critics particularly stressed that Russia was ready to come to the aid of Czechoslovakia, but at the time offers of Russian help seemed to the British, French, and even the Czechs to be unconvincing, as neither Poland nor Romania would allow Russian troops through their territory. How could they help Czechoslovakia? It is thus not surprising that Chamberlain and Daladier warmly welcomed Mussolini's last-minute proposal on September 28th for a four-power conference in Munich. The next day, under pressure from his generals and from Mussolini, who had dreaded a premature war, Hitler reluctantly agreed to delay the occupation of the Sudetenland until October 10th, and to allow an international commission to map the boundary line. He also consented, together with Britain, France, and Italy, to guarantee that what remained of the independence of Czechoslovakia, and signed a declaration which affirmed the desire of Britain and Germany never go to war with one another again. This was supplemented by a similar declaration signed by Reichsmuth, Hitler's foreign minister, in Paris in December. It is too simple to call Munich a triumph for Hitler. He had it is true, secured the Sudetenland, but arguably he had been cheated on his real aim, the destruction of Czechoslovakia, which apparently was now about to be protected by an international guarantee. Germany seemed to be in danger of being enmeshed in just the sort of international agreement Hitler had always hoped to avoid. However, it is difficult to argue that Munich was a great victory for Chamberlain. Arguably, he did buy some more time for rearmament, but to the outside world, Munich seemed to be a major defeat for Britain and France. The British ambassador in Tokyo reported that the Japanese reaction is that we are prepared to put up with almost any indignation rather than fight. The result is that, all in all, our prestige is at low ebb in the East, the destruction of Czechoslovakia. The argument that Hitler merely responded to events is hard to sustain when his foreign policy from October 1938 to March 1939 is analyzed. His main priority remained the destruction of Czechoslovakia. On October 21st, 1938, the German army was ordered to draw up fresh plans for military action. Simultaneously, Hitler dangled the bait of territorial gains at the expense of the Czechs in front of the Hungarians, Poles, and Romanians in order to enlist their support. German agents were also sent into Slovakia to fuel agitation against Peru. In practice, Britain and France were already beginning to recognize Czechoslovakia as a German sphere of influence. The German representatives were allowed to dominate the international commission that was to map out the new frontiers after the secession of the Sudetenland, and neither power protested when Germany refused to participate in finalizing the terms of the joint guarantee of Czechoslovakia in February 1939. On March 6, 1939, the Germans were given the opportunity finally to dismember Czechoslovakia when the Czechs suddenly moved troops into Slovakia to crush local demands for independence, which the Nazis, of course, had helped to stir up. Hitler persuaded the Slovaks to appeal to Berlin for assistance. On March 14, 1939, the Czech president, Emil Kossuth, was ordered to travel to Berlin, where he was ruthlessly bullied into resigning the fate of his country into the hands of the Führer. The next day, German troops occupied Peru, and Slovakia was turned into a German protectorate. This action was to precipitate a major diplomatic revolution in Europe. Britain broke decisively with its traditional foreign policy of avoiding a continental commitment, and together with France guaranteed Poland against a German attack. Munich became a byword for surrender and cowardice. Critics pointed to the following. The Czechs were not consulted and were simply told to hand over part of their country. Nazi persecution was influenced on Jewish people and socialists in the occupied areas. The safeguards in the agreement were ignored. It gave clear signals to Hitler that the democracies were weak. Any chance of cooperation with the USSR was lost, and Stalin was led to the conclusion that he had to ally with Hitler instead. The League of Nations was ignored. The 35 army divisions and strong defenses of Czechoslovakia were lost. France and Britain overestimated German ability to wage successful war in 1938. The German army was not strongly mechanized, and Hitler's own generals had reservations about its operational ability. However, by 1939, Germany was stronger and better prepared for war. Defenders have pointed out the following. In 1938, Britain and France did not have public support for war. British defenses, particularly in the form of air power, had greatly increased by 1939, and the Munich Conference gave the time needed to rearm more intensively. The British Empire and the USA would now have supported a war which would have denied German speakers the right to be a part of Germany in 1938. Hitler wanted war and was deprived of it by the British diplomacy. Britain was in a such stronger position morally and in military terms to go to war in 1939 than in 1938. the German reaction to the British guarantee. In October 1938, and then again in January and March 1939, Hitler unsuccessfully sounded out the Poles about the return of Dazing. The construction of a road and rail link through the corridor, and about joining the anti-Comintern Pact. In return, the Poles were offered the eventual prospect of acquiring land in Ukraine. Essentially, Hitler wanted to turn Poland into a reliable satellite, but given the fate of Czechoslovakia, it was precisely this status that the Poles finally rejected in March 1939. The Anglo-French guarantee of Poland, far from deterring Hitler, convinced him that Poland would have to be eliminated. Even if this meant war with Britain and France, on May 23rd, Hitler told his generals stuff.